Hey y'all, thank you for joining me for another video. Hopefully your week was a good week. Mine was eventful, put it to you that way, but I got through it. So I follow a lot of sites on Instagram about foster care, trauma within the foster care, with kids that are in the foster care system, trauma with sex trafficking victims and abuse victims of all kinds. And something that I saw this week caught my attention, and I knew I had to talk about it, especially with this being Domestic Abuse Awareness Week month. It says, "Why didn't you just leave your trafficker?" So this is a question that comes up next for everyone. Why didn't you just leave? That is a normal question for a healthy adult brain to ask. But you have to remember, most of us in the midst of trafficking don't have healthy adult brains. We have vulnerabilities. We've been desensitized to a variety of factors, groomed. Our boundaries are pushed. So that made me think about what I, as a abuse survivor, have had endured for many years. And I've actually gotten that question a few times from very well meaning people who don't understand. First of all, when a person is abused, either physically or emotionally, your brain is rewired, or it's being rewired, to where you think it's not that bad, that it's somehow normal because it's your normal, normal, and you don't know anything different, especially if you've endured it for so many years. And though that particular thing was applied to sex traffic victims, it goes for any abuse victim. And so I'm going to go, because I've gotten that question before, I'm going to speak on my experience and I've um what I've endured and what I've learned in the year and a half that I've been going to therapy about what all the abuse I endured, not only from my ex but from my father, had done to rewire me. First of all, I'm sure I've mentioned this before, but for anybody that's new, I'm going to mention it again. My father was an abusive individual. Um, he abused my mother. My sister and I witnessed that until my mother got the courage to leave when I was 11 and my sister was 7. I remember witnessing my mother, who had just gotten her driver's license. She didn't get her driver's license till my sister and I were older, even. I was 9 and my sister was 5, roughly. And she was trying to parallel park in front of our house. And my father got mad at her because he wasn't parking well in her estimation, in his estimation rather. So instead of coaching her through it, he just huffed on down to where the car was, opened the door, pulled her out of the car, and in pulling her out of the car, she lost her balance and fell on the grass where the car was, by the grass in the street, and just started moving the car and parking it, not even making sure she was okay. And my sister and I witnessed that. And so that um, is trauma and rewires your brain. And then my mom left, and then she married a wonderful man a few years later, and I had all of that positivity, but in the background, I was still having being manipulated by my father. Because my father could manipulate me. He couldn't really manipulate my sister too much. I don't know how she was able to um, be immune to that. But, and he manipulated me into feeling guilty for loving my stepfather. Because in my father's eyes, if I loved my stepfather, I couldn't love my father, which is ridiculous. And I gave my parents a lot of grief, my mom and my stepfather, a lot of grief because of that abuse. Now, I'm not blaming him, I take responsibility for my own actions. I was a brat as a teenager when it came to that. But I was also in conflict because I felt guilty for loving my stepdad. I loved him dearly. He was a great man, never introduced my sister and I to anything but his daughters. And so, because I was still being manipulated by my father, my brain didn't have a chance to rewire to a healthy brain. And then when I got older and I was living with my mother, and my father was like, well, you're not coming down to stay with me, because I was living in another state with my mom and my stepdad. And I said, well, no. And he said, well, that's not fair. Uh, your mom has your sister to take care of her because they're close. Who's going to take care of your dear old dad? And I'm like, wow, okay. I was 16 when he said that. And at 16, you don't think to say, you're 40, you can take care of yourself. And instead, I felt this overwhelming obligation to take care of him. So I moved back down to stay with him. And my mom got hurt by that for many years because she thought I had chosen him over her. It wasn't until later years, in fact, within the past decade or so, that she realized it was him manipulating me. And that it wasn't that I just arbitrarily chose him over her. And even through my adult life, after I got married and had kids, he took advantage of my need for his help, because I couldn't work because our two oldest were young and we couldn't afford daycare, and I couldn't find a job that worked around my ex's schedule. And my ex was spending money like it was water. So my father would help us out with rent or food or whatever we needed. And in return, he would take advantage of that help and say, okay, well, I've done this for you. I need you to go do groceries for me. I need you to wash my laundry. I need you to do this. And I felt like, well, he's helping us. This is the least I could do. It didn't occur to me back then, and admittedly, I needed his help, so it wouldn't have made much of a difference if it had. But he was only helping because he knew that he could get me to do things for him in return. And that was grooming me for to be to have my ex abuse me. Obviously, my father and my ex didn't work together on this, obviously, because they didn't like each other. Um, I realize now that they didn't like each other because they were both very, very similar. Um, and so with my ex, I was already wired to be used to divorce. Oh my goodness, be used to abuse. And so with my ex, he would never talk up to me. He would never lift me up. It was always beat me down some way with his words. Um, Very rarely, I mean, there were occasions when he would lift me up, tell me, you know how beautiful you are? I would look at him and flat out say, no, I don't. And he would act like he would get convicted. It's like, oh man, I need to be better. But those were just words. It was basically throwing me a bone to, it was part of the manipulation. Because now, being a year and a half out, I realized that all the times he treated me decently or talked up for me or was super protective of me, it wasn't because he cared. It was because, one, I was his property. He treated me like chattel, like I was his. Um, I liken it to, if any of you have seen the movie Titanic, when um, Rose and Jack first meet, when Rose is contemplating suicide and she almost falls overboard and he pulls her up, and Cal is then comes up front because everybody hears the commotion of a woman screaming, and Cal looks at Jack and says, what gives you the right that you can lay hands on my fiance? My fiance. um, Cal wasn't worried about how Rose was hurt. It was just Rose was his. And that's how it was with my ex. He was protective of me, not because he cared, but because I was his. And he didn't want to get rid of the person he could manipulate. And I was his meal ticket. I did everything. Um, so when he would treat me nice, that was just a way of manipulating me, and it would get me confused because I would think maybe it's in my head, maybe it's not that bad. When it would go through times of treating me so sweet and caring, encouraging me to buy something for myself, because of course, like most mothers, we don't buy for ourselves. We'll pay $50 for a pair of shoes for our kids, but we won't pay $5 for a pair of shoes that we desperately need. That's a mom. But, and he would encourage me and say, you need to buy this for yourself. If you don't buy it, I'm going to buy it for you. But I now realize what that was. Because, for one, that way he wouldn't feel, it was like easing his conscience when he was buying all of this stuff, spending my money like water on stuff that he wanted by pushing me to get one or two little things. It was like, well, I tell her to get this, you know, and it was a way to cloud my judgment because it's like he always pushes me to get stuff and do for myself and yada yada yada. But it was a form of manipulation because, again, to ease his conscience somehow and make him still look good. Like, she bought this, she bought this. If ever it came up that, if I ever brought up, well, why did you buy this or this or this? Well, you bought this. I mean, I know that. And I never confronted him on what he bought because it was no use, and I knew that. But I also know now that that's why he was so called encouraging me to get a few things for myself here and there. So, all of that manipulated my mind and got me confused. Um, just like when we were in public, he would be so sweet, loving, put his arm around me, hold me, kiss me. And of course, at home or in our vehicle, it was totally different. So I was confused. Um, it wasn't until the last, I don't know, about a year, 2 years, somewhere around that area, that the mask was getting harder and harder for him to keep on. So people that were around us a lot more, especially at church, um, started seeing little snippets of how he was. But before that, he was so sweet in public, so protective, um, but it was all a form of control. Um, I used to have horrible, horrible trouble with my back because I have scoliosis, and because of that, it set off chain reaction where the scoliosis, like towards the center middle of my back, it caused my neck to be out of whack, caused my hips totally be out of whack. My hips, your hips are supposed to rest like this. It caused one side to go in like this and in like that. Um, a medical doctor would have probably referred me to surgery. Um, but surgery is an S word to me, so I chose to go to a chiropractor. I went to a few of them before I found the one I'm at now. That's really good. And it I fell a lot before I started going through regular chiropractic care because I was so out of balance. My spine was like topsy turvy, and even my neck curved backwards. It's supposed to curve one way, and instead it was curving the other. And of course, that's going to cause me to be off balance, and I would fall. Well, for the longest time, he thought I was purposely falling for attention. And I even fussed at him one day when he brought that up. I'm like, don't you notice that when I fall, I hurt myself? Because invariably I'll land on my knees, and my knees are not the best. So, why would I want to fall on my knees and hurt them worse? Do you not know that I'm legitimately hurting for a few days afterwards? Why would I put myself in that much pain just for attention? Well, I realize now that's something he would do. And so that's why he thought I was doing it. And it wasn't until I started going to a chiropractor, and a chiropractor showed, in showing me the x-rays, my ex was there, and he saw the x-rays, and he's like, my goodness, no wonder why you always fell, or you fell a lot. And the chiropractor's like, oh yeah, yeah, it's amazing she can even walk a straight line. And there would be times, I live on the third floor in my apartment building, and it would getting up those steps, especially at first, oh my goodness, it would be torture. And he would actually say several times, you know, at this rate, you're going to wind up being in a wheelchair. Um, he never once encouraged me to try to do anything about it. I'm the one who pushed myself to do something because I got tired of hurting, and I didn't want to end up in a wheelchair because the thought of him having to take care of me and me to be dependent on him that much scared the living bejeebers out of me. So, but I realize now that he wanted me in that wheelchair or depended on him so much that I wouldn't leave. And when I started getting better and doing even better and more mobile, yeah, that's just occurring to me. When I started becoming more mobile and doing better, that's when the emotional abuse started really, really stepping up because he was losing his control. Because if I didn't need him, there was a possibility that I would leave. And that, oh my goodness, y'all, this just came to me. That's why the emotional abuse really started stepping up over the last two 2 years of our marriage, because I was getting more mobile, and also I was getting a better job. When I left the fast food place that I worked at for 14, 15 years and got a better job at a truck stop, at first being paid $1 less than what I was at the fast food place, but I was getting 40 hours a week. So I was actually making more money in the long run. That's when he started stepping up, because he was starting to get scared that I wasn't going to need him, because he was still working at that point, but he was working part-time. I was the one supporting us mainly. And then from the truck stop, I went to work at a call center and making like $1.50 more an hour than what I was making at the truck stop. And that's when it started stepping up even more. Wow. It's like a light bulb went off. And that's what he was, because he was a master manipulator. And that's when he started stepping up the emotional abuse even more, holding me down, beating me down emotionally. Um, he didn't lay a hand on me because he knew I'd call cops like I did back in '07. So he became the master manipulator and manipulated me emotionally. Um, Tell me things like, we're done. If there's anybody at work, where the first call center I worked at, there's anybody over there that is interested in you, go ahead, go date them, because we're done. I don't want you. First of all, I was one of the older ones there. Most of the employees there, as far as guys, were at most maybe 40. Maybe. Y'all, I'm in my 50s. No. I'm not going to go for 30. Most of them were like in their 20s and 30s. There were a couple of supervisors that were in their 40s. But most of the guys there were like in their 20s and 30s. I have kids. I have my oldest is in his 30s. So, no. And I would tell him that. And he's like, well, if anybody older, they hit on you or whatever, go for it. Because we're done. And he was doing it to hurt me. To manipulate me to want to do better. Because he was also having issues with my looks. Um, you know, Going through menopause. You get older, the body changes, and he was having issues with that. Also because he was into porn, heavily into porn. So when a person is into porn like that, they start developing a fantasy. And that will do, nothing will, nothing can satisfy them anymore except for that fantasy world. And that's what was going on. And I didn't know that at the time. I do now. And everybody around me was like, you need to leave him. And, you deserve better than that. But my brain had already been wired to accept abuse from my father and then from him for so long, my ex, that it didn't seem as bad. When I was telling people, when I started talking and telling people, they were horrified. And to be quite honest, I couldn't understand why, because it didn't seem that bad. And I even had a very dear young friend, young gal, that was begging me to leave, because she said she had gone through similar to what I was going through, and she said they don't get better. Narcissists don't get better because they don't ever realize that they are the problem. It's always anybody else, not them. And she was practically begging me to leave him. But I didn't want to leave. I was scared because of many different things. I really wasn't scared of being alone. Um, I've talked to my sister about this. I kind of, the thought of being alone didn't bother me. I actually relish the thought of not being with anyone and being able to do what I want and not have to take anybody else into consideration. You know, it was partially I felt like I would fail if I gave up on the marriage. Um, and again, I've talked about this before. I talked about this in my very first video. How I was reading books that were almost more toxic than my marriage about how I should stay, be the good wife, serve him, um, pray for him, and perhaps he'll change. But ultimately, my loyalties are to him. Not in a case like this. This is a deal breaker. And again, I was of the impression that all this was normal, and I didn't want to leave him because I loved him. And it's like when you love someone, you don't leave them. You take the bad with the good. Well, I realized it I had to reach that point, that solid line that said enough's enough before I finally said no, I'm done. Um, Back in August of 2019 was when I realized it wasn't a matter of when. I mean, it wasn't a matter of if I should leave, it's a matter of when that I need to leave. And that's when I started planning things. Planning my mode of action. And so my brain was not healthy. Something just snapped at that point and woke me up. I say it's God. I also say I found out recently that there were a bunch of ladies at church that were praying for me. Because, like I said, his mask was starting to come off. He wasn't able to keep that act up any longer. So people were starting to see how he was. And so they were praying for me, and I am convinced 1000% that it was their prayers that finally opened my eyes. And a lot of times you hear that, because I took a course on, especially when I was working at a truck stop, I would look up things about this because truck stops, there's all kinds of things that go on at truck stops. Prostitutes, they're called yard lizards, I think they're called, if I remember the term correctly. Lot lizards, prostitutes at truck stops. It's a very demeaning term. And there's also sex trafficking throughout. So I familiarize myself with the signs of someone coming in that could possibly be trafficked. And it said in one of the courses I took that a lot of times these girls, especially that are trafficked, because Boys are trafficked too. But a lot of these girls will be defensive against their trafficker. Where if you say anything wrong against their trafficker, they will immediately go to defense. And that's how I was. People would badmouth him, especially the last 2 or 3 years, and I would immediately come to his defense. And I mean, lickety split. Oh, but you don't know how he is. I know how he is, really. Excuse me. And he's not that bad. It's just, excuse me, my throat's dry. He's just having a tough time right now. He just needs a little understanding. Trust me, he's not that bad. And I even defended him and his actions against my own kids. And that is something that it'll take me a long time, if ever, to not regret. Because I still kick myself for it. I would immediately go to his defense. I would take his side on things. And it was all part of the rewiring. And so, when you ask a person, why don't you just leave? It's because we don't know that we can. We don't know that we should. I did not think I should. All of that time, because my brain was so clouded with all of the abuse that I had endured, that I didn't even know that I really should. Yeah, I had my mother telling me I should. I had my sister, my best friend of 20 some years was telling me I should. My friend that I've had since junior high was telling me I should. But I wasn't convinced that I should. Because of all the rewiring my brain had gone through. I didn't think I should. I felt that, like in some Hallmark movie where the person was horrible and they got a change of heart and they turned around and became all this wonderful person that replaced the horrible person they were. That's what I thought would happen if I just stayed and loved him enough. And then one day, I realized that I couldn't love him enough to make him stop the abuse. I couldn't love him enough to show him his wrongs. And no, to let him see his wrongs. Because everything was my fault. I mean, I would be sleeping in the middle of the night and wake up to hear him talking to someone on a suicide hotline, bad-mouthing me, saying how horrible I was, and that in spite of it, he loves me and he can't picture leaving me. And I would pretend to be asleep, but I wasn't, and I would do my best to stay awake so I could listen to everything he's telling these people. And it got me. Because everything was my fault in his mind. When I'm not saying I was perfect, y'all, because I wasn't. but it wasn't all my fault. But that's why it's hard for a person who's been abused for so long to leave. And that's why it's also hard for a person who's been abused to stay gone. I have a friend who had been abused over and over by her partner. She'd leave him. Then he would treat her so nice and sweet and say, "Come on, I'm sorry. Please, let's just reconcile, make this work again." And she'd take him back. After a week or two, he's treating her like dirt again, being a Class A jerk. She'd leave, and this happened a couple of times. And I felt myself getting aggravated with her because I'm like, why don't you just leave? Do you not learn from my mistakes? Because I've told her everything what I went through. But it dawned on me that she wants so bad for it to work that she wants to believe him when he treats her well after she leaves him. And that's how I was. I wanted so bad to believe that when he treated me nice and treated me well, I wanted to believe that's how he really was. And that deep down he's treating me like this because he loves me. And that the times he's not so loving, it's just because he's going through all kinds of trouble. He had a horrible childhood, horrible mother, horrible father, and so at these times when he treats me well, it's because he truly does love me. But it's not. And it's not anything that's against me. Just like it's not anything against any of you if you're in a relationship and you're going through this. It's not that you're unlovable. It's that they're not capable of loving. They're only capable of manipulating and abusing and keeping that power over someone. Because, and that's what my ex did, especially in the later years when I was getting better job after better job. Each job I got was better than the last. And I honestly believe he started getting scared that I wasn't going to need him because I was, doing so well, making more money each time. Even got a promotion. My first call center job, I wasn't even there a year, and I had already gotten my first promotion. And it was my team that won a particular contract. I was part of that team. And so he started getting more scared. And that's when it really started stepping up to try to keep me under his thumb. And that's when he started really beating me down, saying horrible things. Try to word this nicely. well, there's really no way to word it nicely. Suffice it to say, he had to pretend I was someone else. And we'll leave it at that. Um, saying the cruelest of things just to keep me emotionally dependent on him, because he knew monetarily that I was capable of making way more money than he was. I mean, technically, he could have done well for himself. He had a brain, and he was pretty decent with his hands. He just used his brain for all the wrong things. And so in his mind, he saw that I was making more money than him by quite a bit. Not just like 50 cents an hour or something, but a couple of dollars an hour. And that's when he realized that he needed to step things up and keep control of me. And that's when he started bashing me to keep me under his thumb, so he could keep me around and use me as his whipping stone. So I hope I help give a little insight to those of you that have a dear friend or loved one that's going through abuse. Might help you understand why they don't just leave. In the nutshell, when you're abused for that long, like I was, or like in some instances, like in sex trafficking, that intentional. Because those sex traffic victims aren't necessarily abused for decades, but the abuse they receive over however long until they find a way out, it's intense and it's intentional. All to keep that victim around to serve their purpose. And it's intense, and it rewires your brain to the point to where you don't see clearly. So just like it took me to realize that my friend wanted to believe the best about her abuser, just like I wanted to believe the best about my ex. These people, these victims, want to believe the best about their abusers, because most of them come from very troublesome backgrounds, and so therefore they've already had that trauma and that abuse, and so it makes it easier to continue the abuse. Well, y'all, this is about the longest video I've made to date. I hope that it's given you some insight. And if y'all have any questions, feel free to send me a message, private message, or comment below. I'll be happy to answer any questions. If you're the first time watching and you like what you see, subscribe, hit like. Y'all have a blessed week. Stay safe out there and stay blessed.